discuss mental health with Nupur Dhingra Paiva. Nupur is an associate fellow with the British Psychological Society and a mother of two. She is the lead child and adolescent psychotherapist for Family Tree, a child and adolescent mental health team in New Delhi, which she started in 2018. She has written a book called Love and Rage, The Inner Worlds of Children, and also co-founded the Art of Sports. You can see the banner behind her for Art of Sports, which is a development program for girls using sports and group therapy with her husband. She also teaches MPhil students at the Ambedkar University in Delhi. Thank you for joining us today, Nupur.
Thank you for having me, Loveleen.
We had asked our audience to send us questions in advance for this discussion today, and I'd be taking up these questions with Nupur. So we had like a huge amount of questions. I've narrowed them down to about 14 questions. We are in an unprecedented situation due to the pandemic and lockdown, working from home, schooling from home, little or no physical human contact or interaction. Human beings are social animals and we thrive on human contact. I'm sure most of us are finding it very difficult to adjust to the new normal. And in so many ways, we are all forced to kind of look inwards. And I think that's where mental health comes in. And my first question to Nupur is, Nupur, what is mental health and how does it affect us?
Loveleen, I had this, I did an Instagram live last week and I had a group of 16-year-olds ask me this question. And cheekily, I turned it back and I said, well, you know, what do you experience as mentally healthy? And my 16-year-old host said that to her, it meant feeling in balance and feeling good.
Right.
And I thought that was actually pretty good as an understanding for 16 especially. And I just wanted to, I thought I'd just start from there actually, but to add a couple of things.
Yeah.
One being that by the time you're our age, you know that balance only exists because we know what out of balance feels like.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So we have an internal experiential understanding of what out of balance felt like or feels like, and therefore we know what balance feels like. And so really for each of us, that is an experiential thing. The other bit is that, is it really possible to feel good all the time?
Or say happy?
Yeah. I mean, then we'll all be on, you know, drugs and rock and roll.
Steroids.
Substances.
Substance.
So what's mentally healthy, the way we understand it in our profession, is to be responsive to the moment. And like you just said, the moment right now is so unprecedented. It's so full of anxiety.
Yes.
That for all of us to feel anxious is actually adaptive. It is in fact mentally healthy right now to be anxious, because if we were to deny our anxiety, then we'd be out like on Florida Beach without our masks. And if we were to not respond to it, then we would be putting ourselves and people we love in danger. So what is mentally healthy right now? It is mentally healthy to be a bit scared and be a bit on alert and to, you know, wear your mask and wash your hands and not go out too much.
Yeah.
So it's really about being responsive to what is reality. That's mental health.
So all this anxiety and stress that we deal with, and especially in these circumstances, do traditional Indian practices like meditation, chanting, and yoga help? And what must we do to stay kind of balanced and healthy?
That's actually a really relevant question because, you know, when we say the word mental health, often there is some kind of, I think it's the language itself that sort of suggests that it's all up here and this part is sort of left out. And it's our Eastern sort of traditions that really remind us that body and mind is one.
Yeah.
It's a connection, it's circular, it's a loop, it's not separate. I've often said that mind-body dualism is kind of like what's got us into this mess often. So yeah, and anxiety isn't something that happens in our heads. Anxiety is a biophysiological response. It takes in our bodies.
Yes, your gut starts feeling, you know, nervous. When you're nervous, your gut, that's the first effect it has on people.
Yeah, and so, and if we just pay attention to the bodily responses, everything from a tightness in the chest to your heart beating faster, sweaty palms, dry mouth, butterflies in the stomach. So this is nervousness, you know, we're all familiar with this. But when it gets to be anxiety, then we're looking at feeling a bit sick or wanting to rush to the loo or getting a headache. These are also signs of anxiety, but this is at a higher level, right? But all of these, it's like you didn't make that up. It's an actual biophysiological response in the body, which is mediated by neurohormones.
Yeah.
So it's a cortisol is released, norepinephrine is released, adrenaline is released, these things happening in our body. So actually practices that help us release anxiety from the body are very beneficial. Yoga, breathing, meditation if you can, but honestly, mere bas ki baat nahi hai. Like, it's a personality hazard is I'm too hyper. And so for that's why I had to, with Richard, invent the art of sport, because meditation was too static.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to like create something that would violently or vigorously let it out.
Yeah.
But it's all part of the same thing, which is that because our anxiety lives in our bodies, responding to the body makes sense.
Yeah. So what kind of exercises would you recommend one should practice to stay positive and calm through the day? That's another question somebody's asked.
Honestly, I don't know whether calm through the day is really possible.
Yeah.
You know, most of my work is with children and adolescents. And as you can imagine, it's a developmental stage where they are just like bubbling all the time with creativity and energy, and stuff is happening. It's just developmentally, they're designed to be bubbling. So calm is like just not happening. So especially in this sort of fake sit in one place kind of way.
Yeah.
So some of my clients are finding that they are busying themselves or like really focusing all that energy into something, into like one big obsession. So there's one child I can think of who started to teach herself how to play the guitar. All lockdown, she's just been obsessed with that guitar. Day in and day out. And her parents are just like, getting the same song again and again and again. And who's decided that she loves Chinese history.
Yeah.
And her father's a professor, and both of them are sitting, and they have a time slot in the week where they sit and discuss Chinese history, or he teaches her Chinese history.
Wow.
Right. There is another child who she's always been an artist, but is now just like prolifically using up canvases, and they're running out of canvases all the time, and they constantly have to go out to the market and buy canvases. So this is how the younger lot who they can't stay calm.
Yeah.
Because developmentally, they are plugged into have zip.
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, as a personality, are you calm? Is this even realistic for you? And then, go ahead. But in terms of exercise, there's Some people like to run.
Yeah.
Some people have mixed feelings about running. Some people like me can make it there mentally, but my body won't let me run more than a kilometer. I personally put on the music very loud and I dance.
Yeah.
And it helps me to just let all that zip out. And then after that, I can feel calm.
Yeah.
For a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's very individualistic, really.
Yeah.
Whatever works for you.
Yeah.
How do we know that I'm talking about mental health. How do we know that we need professional help? Can we point out certain symptoms if there is a mental illness?
See, your basic rule of thumb is anything that you feel stuck in for more than 3 weeks.
State of mind, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And so it's not so much that there's anything that is different between normal and ill. Everything that we find in what we call mentally ill is there for us to see in our normal versions as well. I mean, even obsessions and compulsions and depression and anxiety and rage and impulsivity and wanting to occasionally kill people. These are all, there are normal versions of this, like that exist everywhere on a day-to-day basis. It's about when it owns you.
Yeah. Yeah.
When it's no longer like dynamic and it kind of like gets stuck.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very useful tip. Also, I think a lot of people use the word depression so easily. How can you tell the difference between sadness, feeling sad, and say clinical depression or a personality disorder?
Oh, well, I wouldn't recommend trying to diagnose a personality disorder.
Okay.
And please don't go to the internet. Go to a human being. Personality disorders are notoriously difficult to pin down.
Right.
Or diagnose. And even, I mean, it takes a lot of experience, even in mental health professionals, to be able to accurately describe or catch what is a personality disorder. So I'd say, let's not go there.
Okay. So talking of sadness and clinical depression.
Yeah. So again, see, sadness has a trigger. It's an identifiable trigger. You know what's making you sad. After there has been an outpouring of that grief, there is a feeling of relief.
Yes.
After that, one might want to go to sleep or withdraw or be quiet, but there is a feeling of relief, an unburdening.
Yeah.
Depression doesn't leave you like that. Depression is like a black cloud that is just sitting on you. And everything goes gray. And there is no joy in anything. And there is everything that, you were motivated for, you've lost that energy. And that this feeling isn't just like a day or two or a week. It's like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. Then you're looking at depression.
Okay.
Yeah. At the same time, if this has taken place after a divorce or losing someone you love or a major life disaster, again, then this is still adaptive sadness, right? So we don't quickly jump to diagnose because honestly, it doesn't do anybody any good. If you are miserable, whether I call it sadness or I call it depression, you are still miserable.
Yeah.
So I personally am quite wary of labels, but yes, the basic thing, I mean, are you responding to a life event or has it got separated out from that? And is it like continuing now, like it has a life of its own? एक साल बाद when हुआ था, but एक साल बाद there's still the remnants of that, and it's not just the remnants, it's like sitting on you.
Yeah.
Then depression.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Then there was a question somebody asked about how can you, what is bipolar disorder? And how do you identify a borderline case?
I'd say don't.
Okay.
Bipolar, again, is difficult. It's a little more, I mean, it's more maybe evident, sometimes, theoretically speaking, than borderline. Bipolarity is traditionally understood as having opposite extremes of mood, where there is a low mood, but then it's punctuated by periods of manic highs and
like a euphoria kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, but again, that's sort of typified, bit prototypical. Borderline, it's a personality state, and it's something that emerges in relationships. So it's not like you can just like point it. So because it's relational.
Yeah.
You again, it's something, it's one of the most difficult, complex aspects of mental health work. And unless you've been properly trained to understand borderline states, don't go there.
Right.
After 20 years, scares me.
Right. So in the recent past, we've seen so many of these, so many people actually, including a lot of celebrities opening about their struggles with mental health and anxiety. Generally, people find it difficult to open up about their anxiety and mental health issues. There's still that stigma attached to people seeking professional help for such conditions. Would you like to comment on this? And what is actually psychotherapy? If somebody is to go for psychotherapy, what does it mean? What does it entail?
Okay. The first part is not really a question, is it?
No, it's just a statement that, there is a stigma attached to mental health, and, people find it difficult to speak about it and also seek professional help, therefore.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that. It is very difficult, and it's difficult mainly because we have been brought up to hide. Hide when we struggle. I mean, we really validated for success and making it. But what about when you don't make it, or when you're not successful?
Yeah.
So everything from our education system to our upbringing is very outcome oriented. It's very
only achievements are rewarded, really.
Yeah. So we hide our struggles, we hide our tough days, and then obviously we become like that. I mean, that becomes a facade we carry around with us everywhere. So since you asked the question about what is psychotherapy, I thought I'd take this opportunity to read a section out of Love and Rage, where Love and Rage really was written when I kind of went through this period where I was very upset, distressed, but also irritated by just the sheer gap in understanding that I would come across. Like, people would make, it was just an impatience really, that I wish more people understood what happened inside a psychotherapy consulting room. Because there's this fantasy about it being mad or bad or weird or crazy, none of which is true. So And most of the literature we have about psychotherapy is sort of based in the West. And so I'm going to write something that was very much based in the consulting room that was right here in Delhi. So that's what this is. And so I'll just read out a little bit. Stop me if I carry on too long.
No.
Okay.
You have plenty of time.
So the essence of what happens in psychotherapy is that a complete stranger agrees to keep us in mind. Slowly, that begins the process of us being able to keep ourselves in mind. There is a lot more to it, of course, many techniques and theories and nuances and years of training, but it would amount to nothing if one were unable to keep the other in mind. It's not easy, though, to believe and trust that another can keep us in mind, and building that trust takes time. How long it takes depends to a large extent on the quality of feeling kept in mind as a child that we received in our earliest relationships. For psychotherapy, to us, as work, is a privilege, an honor, and a rare opportunity to be witness to another life in a way that we do not get to do in our other relationships. Even in families, parents and children interact mainly through instruction, expectation, and obedience. We do not often share personal emotional histories in detail and depth. Grandparents' lived lives are eons away from those of their grandchildren. We don't talk enough, tell enough stories, or ask enough questions of our loved ones, mainly to protect each other from intense feelings and the fear of being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Psychotherapy is not easy, nor does it promise to make you happy. The process invites people to be honest to and of themselves. It pushes people to make a commitment to their emotional growth and to take responsibility in their lives and in their internal worlds. It does promise to make you, your relationships, and expectations from self and other real. It makes you accept the meaning of being human. Often, I wonder whether this is part of the reason for psychotherapy being in the margins. It is not easy to accept ordinary human fallibility. We are all damaged to some extent. We are all somewhat dysfunctional, self-sabotaging, self-punishing, depressed, anxious, defensive, isolating ourselves, or intruding on others, or somewhere in between. This is not my original statement. It's been voiced with greater passion and daring by other writers over the decades, and I'm quoting now. What we call normal is a product of repression, denial, splitting, projection, introjection, and other forms of destructive action on experience. The more one sees this, the more senseless it is to continue with generalized descriptions of what we today call mental illness. So, do we all need psychotherapy? I was asked this by no one less erudite and hard to mess with than my own mother. Is it not normal to be this way? We have all been at the receiving ends of failures, disappointments, careless comments by friends, parents, or loved ones that have hurt us, and that we have coped with it. So, is this not just what happens in life? It is, absolutely. All of this is undeniably, completely ordinary. It is also undeniably painful. Whether one wants to take a closer look at it, at ourselves, our lives, and how it connects to others, is a matter of choice and of degree. A lot depends on what we make of the too much or the too little that we got. It's always a matter of degree. How dysfunctional, how depressed, how anxious. At which point, the point at which that underlying pain becomes actively distressing or damaging to other relationships is the point at which people usually look for help. Why have you come to see a psychotherapist? In one form or another is a standard first question in a first psychotherapy session. And that's followed by the question, why now? Regularly, my colleagues and I are confronted with the following question in its various versions. But do I really need therapy? Or do I really need therapy? Or do I really need therapy? Are we really aware of all that we need to nourish the different parts of ourselves? For many of us, becoming aware of what our own needs are is in itself a challenge. Attending to them, yet another. The truth is that therapy can help us discover what we need from our lives and our loves. Therefore, there is always an internal struggle about therapy and whether it is really needed. It is portrayed as an indulgence, which one could do without, because there's always more people who are suffering more in the world. लोगों के पास खाने को खाना नहीं है, रहने को घर नहीं, therapy के लिए जा रहे हैं. Which one could do without, or a betrayal of some other dearly held self-belief, worldview, or a person. But it's not my role to talk someone into therapy or to force anyone to change. My work is to help people become aware of their inner voices and to be able to differentiate their own voice from those of others who they hold dear. I do believe that we could all use psychotherapy in some form or another because it makes us feel heard, validated, and attended to. It makes us better observers of how and why we are the way we are. It may make some things clearer, and that may also make some things more painful. So we often choose to not know, to not change, to stay with the pain that we know than to risk the unknown. There is, after all, some bliss in ignorance, and it works well for some of us.
So well said. Beautiful. Talking of, I know you said just now that it's not your job to push someone into therapy. So related to that is a question for professional help. So when you know that a loved one probably needs therapy and they could be in denial, how do you get a family member to get them to therapy? Is there a way? How do you convince somebody like that?
Well, let me ask you. If it's done in a way of, really, you need to go to therapy.
Huh.
Is it going to work?
No. Never works.
The short answer to that is with compassion.
Right.
It's when we express compassion towards the other that, look, I see that you are struggling.
Yeah.
Of course, anybody who is struggling is usually also creating or making themselves a pain in the neck to other people.
Yeah.
Right? And it's very hard to not focus on that. Like, you are crazy, so therapy, or who here needs to go to therapy? And we had, at the office, at Family Tree, we had a thing written on the board for a few weeks, which said most people go to therapy to deal with people in their lives who will not go to therapy.
Yeah, that's true.
So there is always that. But the short answer is with compassion. Like, do we see my family members, my brother, my cousin, my parent, do I really see their suffering? And do I come to it with compassion and invite them to consider the possibility that they don't have to suffer?
Yeah.
They could actually attend to it in some way.
Yeah. So coming to the current scenario once again, working from home has led to the blurring of personal and professional life, leading to a whole lot of complications. And being a mother of two, working full time, please share some of your personal practices that has helped you remain balanced during these difficult times.
Well, you can see that I'm in a room which has a jhanda at the back.
Yes.
And I'm sitting here without my slippers. So you're in my home, really. Like I am in yours now, lovely.
Yeah.
The thing with that balance business is that it's like a seesaw that it doesn't stay balanced very long, to be honest. It's constantly tipping over one way or another. And I'm not working full time. I am lucky that I work for myself, which was another part of, I mean, there was a question somewhere I read earlier where somebody was asking about that. And that was actually a big part of being able to create balance in my life, was to be my own boss. Because how can I create balance in my life when I'm not in charge of one large chunk in my life, such as my job?
Yeah.
I actually chose to quit working for an institution in order to have more say in the way in which my time was managed, in the way in which I chose to distribute my energies. The Indian work scenario is not ready for work and life balance. The Indian work scenario treats the worker as a commodity, which of course what capitalism does everywhere, but we haven't made enough noise, I think, yet as workers, that there's more to us than worker bees or worker ants.
Yeah.
And so because I designed my own day and my own time, it's been so much simpler for me than I'm sure it is for many other people. Children are, well, also around. And because my office is this screen right now, they're often like hovering at the edge of the screen, and one arm of mine will go out, which is basically doing,
don't come. Yes.
So that's one way I manage my work and life. Yeah, is to acknowledge that, I don't know, is my life in my work, or is my work in my life? Or why do we conjure this up as opposites? Actually, both mine. The children are mine, the work is mine. I wanted all of it. So try and have that conversation with myself on a regular basis. There are times when I put in too many meetings in a day, and then on that day there is no balance. And then there are other days where I manage the balance. So the short answer is, it's a bit hit and miss. Take your priorities, and like, they're all your priorities. Like, I wanted these children, so they are also.
Yeah.
It's so easy to dump it on them, you know, like, oof, children are such a pain. But hey, you know, they didn't ask to be born.
Yeah. Exactly. And
if I answered anyone's question, other than
keeping a sense of humor, I think, or conversations with yourselves as you said, probably.
It reminds me of what was it? It was a BBC thing, right? That was going around, where there was this kid who came barging into the room.
Yes, there was the hilarious video that went viral where this news anchor was commenting on some situation in China, and the kids kept coming in, and the wife had to come and get the children out of the room. And there are many videos like that which have done the round since then.
Exactly. And can we just stop fooling ourselves?
Yeah.
You know, the kids outside the door are as much part of my life as this conversation right now, which is from my professional part of my world. So
exactly.
And, you know, and we're now in each other's homes. So let's just accept it.
Yeah, exactly. So I have a question from a colleague who says, I'm feeling very uncomfortable sitting in one place for long durations. What can I do to keep myself engaged and kind of cool in such situations?
Well, if you're having trouble sitting in one place, how about don't keep sitting in one place?
The simplest advice, yeah. Stand.
Move.
Yeah.
I understand. I understand that it may not be possible to get a change of scenery because of lack of restraint on space, or where your Wi-Fi won't reach, or you know, you can hear the pressure cooker too loudly, or whatever it is. But give yourself breaks. this sitting in one place, why the punishment?
Yeah.
And yet an expectation that you need to be calm through it all.
Yeah.
Started out on this lockdown experiment, we were, told it's a couple of weeks. And now, like the frog in the boiling pot, the water has just been getting hotter and hotter and hotter. And now we're like, I don't know, week what and day 180 something.
Almost 5 months now.
Yeah. So, it's not, what can we expect from ourselves?
Yeah. Don't be too hard on yourself.
No, please don't be hard on yourself at all.
Yeah.
So please move.
So there's another question about sleep. How can we maintain good sleep hygiene in such a traumatic time? I personally have broken and disturbed sleep on most occasions. So there are people who are not able to sleep, maybe because of the cycle or anxiety. Do you have any recommendations for such people?
What you haven't mentioned in that list is television.
Yes, that'll come later, but yes, it's there.
So, there are many reasons why sleep goes out of the window, and some of us are more susceptible to sleep being disturbed than other things. Loveleen, we lost you. Saurabh?
Yeah, Nupur, just a second. I guess her net is acting a little erratic. Let me check.
Okay. Well, I'll answer that question in the meantime.
Sure.
Okay, so sleep. Yeah, so if our bodies aren't tired enough, power failure here in Gurgaon. Okay. I guess that affects many of us.
Nupur, I'll be taking over for Loveleen for the duration that she's going to take to join us back, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. So as
Perfect.
I was saying, that there's many things that affect sleep. If our bodies aren't physically tired enough, we may not be able to fall asleep. If our minds are too active, and that includes anxiety, then we're going to have trouble falling asleep. The third thing that we often don't think about enough is screens. Whether it's a phone screen or television screen, you're watching Netflix in bed, that's not good for sleep. So you did mention sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene does recommend that you don't have any stimulating screen kind of devices, etc., for about at least an hour before you sleep. And that might be helpful to kind of consider. Anxiety is certainly up there as reasons why we don't get to fall asleep. One of those symptoms is racing thoughts, or just like thinking. And that's not conducive to sleeping either. But racing thoughts are a sign of anxiety as well. If we think about how anxiety as a neurohormonal response in our bodies is about responding to a threat. So you can imagine that falling asleep is pretty low on the priority list for an organism that is alert and ready to respond to a threat, right? So something calming as bedtime approaches would be a good idea as well.
Thanks, Nupur. That's really helpful. But I think this has become a pattern for everybody. I mean, considering the situation presently, I think sleep is one of the things that has taken a hit for most of us, I would say. And this is definitely going to be helpful for us. So I'm going to move to the next question, which has come from another colleague. And the question is that this pandemic, it's made people very paranoid about all kinds of ailments. How does one deal with this sense of global hopelessness and negativity that comes with it? Like, you're constantly paranoid about, even when you're stepping out, and you're constantly coming back and washing your hands, or taking that extra precaution that you probably wouldn't on other days. But it's I mean, it's still there at the back of your mind. So how do you sort of deal with this? Lovely, it's back.
Well, it's really hard, right, to be able to separate out what is adaptive anxiety and what is paranoid. I mean, firstly, it really does depend on where you live, what is the spread of infections in your neighborhood, who you live with at home. Do you have, elderly parents who are more susceptible, and things like that. So that is very difficult to get a balance on. And I suppose in other words, how much are you responding to reality and how much of this is catastrophizing? It's a pretty fine line right now. So we don't want people to be in denial, because that's very dangerous, and then you end up like America. And you don't want people to be suffering extra anxiety when they have done what they can. I suppose that's the main thing. Like, what can you do? What is in your hands? What is in your control? And are you doing that much? So can you minimize trips for groceries? Are you not, are you making sure that you're not taking undue risk, like meeting people socially? When you go out, remember your mask and keep your hands washed and things like that. But do you really need to avoid takeaways? Maybe not. So. Yeah, I think one does need to respond to where you are and who you're living with and what all you have to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's definitely a sensible way of going about it. We have Loveleen back online, so I'm going to let her take over from now.
Sorry, the electricity just went off and I had to kind of try and switch. All right, so continuing from where Tejashree left, we have a question related to the current scenario as well with regard to children. So how does the child perceive the parents' routine of working from home? This is especially for very young children. Eventually, when the regular schedule resumes and parents join back, what impact will it have on the child, and how does one cope with this new set of sudden separation anxiety? The child's gotten used to having her mom at home all the time, and now she's going to go back to office. So how does one deal with this?
Well, all these moms, that you had to deal with it at some point in the beginning. Do you remember how you did it then? How it was not easy, and baby cried, baby threw, made themselves heard, made their displeasure known, which is actually a healthy response. So what I would say is, yes, children, honestly, young children seem to be quite pleased about their parents being home.
Yeah.
Adolescents, not so much.
No. Yeah.
So, as far as the young children are concerned, it'll be a case of you win some, you lose some, because young children are also feeling the loss of their friendship groups or their play school. We would expect that some of this is also, will get offset.
Yeah.
Yes, though there is that complication that, mama or papa might have to go back to work before school opens.
Yes.
So, yeah. See, the short answer there is acknowledge their feelings. They are going to be angry. They are going to be sad. And that is the truth.
Yeah, as long as you have a conversation and acknowledge their feelings could work. Depends from child to child, really. Then there is another question about social media and internet and too much television time. So it's not just the children. I think it's adults and everybody is hooked on to, I mean, this is like one respite people have where they connect with other people on social media and there's some interaction going on, but it's so addictive, and then non-stop streaming of television, easy access to it, you are home the whole time. So what are the long-term, short-term implications of all this too much exposure to screen time and social media, internet, and television? Not just for children, even for adults.
I'm reminded of something you said right in the beginning, which is that we are now all at home and we have more time to look inwards. And then when we aren't enjoying what we find, when we look inwards, then we find a screen.
Yeah.
And we look outwards. So the long and the short term implications of this is that we get further and further away from ourselves.
Yeah.
And some of us can bounce back from that, but sometimes it kind of depends on how far you've gone.
Yeah.
But the main issues are one of basically feeling quite disconnected from yourself because you've gone and sat inside the Netflix show and really joined their lives, whether it's Umbrella Academy or Dark or whatever else is going on. And it's so much easier to kind of take yourself out of yourself and leave.
Yeah.
That's what screens help us to do. And while it might be okay in bits, if you do that too much, we kind of end up abandoning ourselves. From a mental health perspective, bad idea. So it's a bit of a dependence as well, right? I mean,
yeah.
It's abuse, but it is still a dependence. If you can't let go, because then you're left with you, and you not want to meet you. Is that a problem?
Yeah, and also interfamily connections, your connection with your children, and interfamily relationships suffer.
Yeah, I mean, ask yourself, who or what are you avoiding if you're spending so much time on the screen?
True.
Well,
right.
I need a note that tells me I have 5 minutes.
Yeah. So now we are going to ask you about your book. This is the last question. And the book that you read an excerpt from earlier, Love and Rage, The Inner Worlds of Children. Tell us a little bit more about the book. And if time permits, would you like to read something else or tell us about the book? I'll leave it to you. This is the last question.
Thank you. Well, then I'll actually just read a little bit from it. I always have trouble choosing paths because I love the whole thing. What can I say? So the preface is also called Why Write This Book? This is a book about children and about the child within all those of us who are chronologically adult. By no means is this a new topic in the field of psychotherapy. In fact, it forms the bedrock of some of the most influential theorizing in the field. Yet, like most simple truths, it seems to need reiteration, as if each society, perhaps each individual, needs to reinvent this wheel for itself. This book had to be written because through my work, it became clear that the subject of small, vulnerable, dependent parts within our adult exteriors was extremely neglected in our society. And because this neglect did not just die with us in our lifetimes, it passed on to our children, damaging succeeding generations. And that the only way to stem the damage was through increased awareness of our inner worlds by connecting up all the lonely bits. I'm just going to stop there right now.
It's beautiful. So for those who are interested in reading the book, it's available on Amazon and it's through Yoda Press. Nupur, thank you so much for being here today. And we had already asked our audience for the questions, so all the questions have been asked. And if there are any more questions, I will give everybody a minute. If there's one, I'll maybe take up one or two questions if there are any, and then we'll end the session.
Okay. How are questions coming in? Are they being typed into a Q&A?
So there is a Q&A, yeah, people normally write on that. And if there is a related question to what you've spoken earlier, it'll come. So I don't see any questions being posed, and I think we took up all of them, so people don't have more questions. Nupur, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you very much for having me, Loveleen. There is one question that is here.
Okay. Has it come?
This has been here for some time actually, about,
okay, I haven't seen it.
About their son who suffers from anxiety, and the pulse rate is also on a higher side. I'd say that that would be expected, right? Because like I said earlier, anxiety is a response in the body. So the pulse is going to be higher. But since you mentioned that he's a young man, but he also has high cholesterol and high blood pressure, it might be worth looking into a combination of his lifestyle, what he's eating, how much he weighs, how much, and health, not just from a body and pipes and plumbing perspective, but also from what's going on mentally for him that is putting so much pressure on his vascular system.
Loveleen, can I add a question here if you don't mind?
Yes, please go ahead.
Just, Nupur, you mentioned just now while you were answering the question about the food habits, right?
Yes.
For this, yeah. So how much of the food habits affects your mental health? Like, how do you correlate the two?
Oh, that's like such a beautiful question. It makes me think of, oh man, what was that man's name? Who did that experiment where for a month he only ate McDonald's morning, noon, and night?
Yes. I know who you're talking about. He made a documentary out of it.
Be overweight, be depressed, and
yes.
see with no energy. And, you know, our bodies are very subtle. And small changes, whether it's in hydration or whether it's in trace minerals or vitamins, actually makes a big difference to us. And it shows in our mood. More fruit, more vegetable, never hurt anybody, always improves mood. Anything that's high in simple sugars, ice cream, too many carbs, white rice, chips. My local kirane ki dukaan tells me that chip sales are through the roof. He's like, logon ke paas kuch karne ko nahi hai, to ghar mein baith ke chips kha rahe hain. This is what he actually said. And yes, of course, some of it is fine, but it's about how much and what is being left out in the process.
There was an article, sorry.
Yeah, Tejasvi is absolutely right. Like we are what we eat.
Yeah, we are what we eat.
Yeah.
There was an article in Harvard Business Review about foods that are good for mental health, you know. It largely spoke about fruits and nuts and...
fruits and nuts.
Fruits and nuts, yes.
Yeah, chips and ice cream are never going to make that list.
Okay. Any more questions then? No, I think that's it. Tejasvi, we are done with questions now. So, Nupur, thank you once again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Take care. Bye-bye. We end the session now. There is a small poll for people who were part of the webinar. If you could just give us feedback, it would be nice. Thank you.
Okay. Take care.